Old Hollywood stars often projected an image of confidence, glamour, and invincibility. But behind the scenes, many of them struggled with deep fears and phobias. Whether it was an intense fear of death, public failure, or specific objects, these anxieties shaped their lives and careers in profound ways. Some stars tried to hide their fears, while others openly admitted to their struggles. Here are some of the most fascinating and extreme phobias that haunted old Hollywood's biggest icons. Marilyn Monroe. Fear of abandonment and public humiliation. Marilyn Monroe, the ultimate sex symbol of Hollywood's golden age, had a deep-rooted fear of abandonment. Her traumatic childhood, marked by being shuttled between foster homes and orphanages, left her with severe anxiety about being left alone or forgotten. This fear extended into her romantic relationships, as she desperately clung to the men in her life, terrified that they would leave her. Her marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller were heavily influenced by her emotional insecurities. Monroe also had a crippling fear of public embarrassment. She suffered from severe stage fright and would often freeze on set, delaying film productions because she was too afraid to perform in front of the camera. Her fear of public failure contributed to her increasing dependence on pills and alcohol, an addiction that eventually led to her tragic demise. Alfred Hitchcock. Fear of police and prison. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, was, ironically, terrified of the police. His fear, known as copophobia, stemmed from a childhood trauma. As a young boy, his father sent him to a police station with a note instructing the officers to lock him in a jail cell for 5 minutes as punishment. This experience left Hitchcock with a lifelong fear of authority figures and incarceration. He avoided police officers at all costs and even refused to drive a car, fearing he might be pulled over. His fear of wrongful imprisonment became a recurring theme in his films, such as The Wrong Man, 1956, where the protagonist is mistakenly accused of a crime and imprisoned. Despite directing countless scenes involving law enforcement, Hitchcock himself never wanted to be near real-life police officers and refused to visit prisons. Judy Garland. Fear of crowds and being watched. Judy Garland, the beloved star of The Wizard of Oz, suffered from scopophobia, an intense fear of being watched or scrutinized. While she was adored by millions, the constant public attention overwhelmed her, making her feel like she was always being judged. This fear was deeply connected to the way MGM Studios controlled her life, monitoring her weight, diet, and personal habits. The pressure to maintain a perfect image gave her severe anxiety, leading to a dependence on drugs and alcohol. Garland's fear of crowds also made public appearances nerve-wracking. Though she performed in front of thousands, she often suffered panic attacks before stepping on stage. Her anxiety only worsened with age, as she feared her audience would eventually turn against her or see her as a failure. This paranoia contributed to her tragic downfall. Clark Gable. Fear of flying. Clark Gable, the legendary star of Gone with the Wind, had a crippling fear of flying. His phobia was so extreme that he refused to board planes for most of his life, choosing trains or cars whenever possible. Ironically, his fear worsened after serving in World War II. Despite his terror, Gable enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces and flew several bombing missions over Europe. The horrors of aerial combat only intensified his aviophobia. Even after the war, he avoided flying as much as possible. When he had no choice but to board a plane, he drank heavily before takeoff to calm his nerves. His intense fear of flying stayed with him until his death. Bette Davis. Fear of aging and losing control. Bette Davis was known for her strong-willed, commanding presence, but behind the scenes, she was terrified of aging. She had an obsessive fear of losing her beauty and power in Hollywood, believing it would lead to her being cast aside. As she grew older, Davis became increasingly paranoid about her appearance. She underwent numerous beauty treatments and refused roles that portrayed her as weak or dependent. Her fear of aging also led to bitter feuds with younger actresses, whom she saw as threats to her career. Later in life, after suffering a stroke, Davis's worst fears came true. She lost control of her body and could no longer command the screen as she once had. This realization devastated her, and she spent her final years isolated and depressed, haunted by the fear she had fought so hard to overcome. Charlie Chaplin. Fear of public speaking. Despite being one of the most beloved silent film stars, Charlie Chaplin had an intense fear of public speaking. His fear was so severe that he avoided interviews and rarely gave public speeches. This phobia became a serious problem when he transitioned to talking films. While his voice was perfectly fine, he dreaded speaking roles and delayed his transition into sound films for as long as possible. Chaplin finally broke his silence in The Great Dictator, 1940, where he gave a powerful speech against fascism. However, even though the scene was widely praised, Chaplin later admitted that it took immense mental effort to deliver it. His fear of public speaking never fully went away, and he continued to struggle with it for the rest of his life. Howard Hughes. Fear of germs. Howard Hughes, the billionaire filmmaker and aviator, was infamous for his crippling fear of germs. His mysophobia led him to live in extreme isolation, refusing to touch anything that hadn't been sanitized multiple times. As his paranoia worsened, Hughes wore tissue boxes on his feet, ordered his assistants to handle objects with gloves, and even burned his clothes if he thought they were contaminated. He spent his final years locked away in dark hotel rooms, surrounded by bottles of his own urine, convinced that the outside world was filled with deadly bacteria. His fear of germs completely controlled his life, making him one of the most extreme cases of mysophobia in Hollywood history. Joan Crawford. Fear of dirt and imperfection. Joan Crawford was obsessed with cleanliness to the point where it became a compulsive fear. She scrubbed her house obsessively, forcing her children to do the same. She even made guests wash their hands multiple times before touching anything in her home. Crawford's fear extended to her own appearance. She was terrified of looking imperfect in any way. She meticulously maintained her looks, undergoing frequent cosmetic treatments to preserve her youth. Her obsessive need for perfection made her one of the most feared and demanding actresses in Hollywood. Gary Cooper. Fear of death. Gary Cooper, known for his tough cowboy roles, was deeply terrified of death. His fear was so intense that he avoided talking about mortality and refused to attend funerals. His thanatophobia became worse when he was diagnosed with cancer in the late 1950s. As his health deteriorated, he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that death was lurking around every corner. He sought out religious guidance in his final years, but remained haunted by his fear until the end. Orson Welles. Fear of being forgotten. Orson Welles, the genius behind Citizen Kane, had an intense fear of being forgotten by history. This fear drove his obsessive perfectionism and relentless work ethic, but it also led to self-destructive behavior. Welles constantly worried that he would die in obscurity, with his work unappreciated or erased from film history. His anxiety about fading into irrelevance worsened after Citizen Kane became controversial, and he struggled to secure funding for future films. He worked tirelessly on ambitious projects that were never finished, and as he aged, he became a recluse, avoiding the public out of fear that he was no longer respected. Even in his final years, Welles continued to give interviews and appear on talk shows, hoping to cement his legacy. His worst fear was dying as a forgotten filmmaker, though today he is rightfully regarded as one of cinema's greatest visionaries. Vincent Price. Fear of fire. Vincent Price, famous for his horror films, had a deep fear of fire, stemming from a childhood incident where he was trapped in a burning building. This fear followed him into adulthood, making him hyper-aware of fire hazards on film sets. During filming, Price would double-check fire exits, refuse to use real flames in scenes, and avoid lighting candles in his personal life. His pyrophobia also extended to his cooking. Despite being a gourmet chef, he was terrified of open flames on stoves and preferred electric appliances whenever possible. Ironically, despite playing villains who often met fiery ends, Price himself was obsessed with fire safety, ensuring that his home was equipped with fire-resistant materials and escape plans. Ingrid Bergman, fear of scandal and public disgrace. Ingrid Bergman, one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses, had a deep fear of public disgrace. This fear was realized in 1950 when she became the center of a massive scandal after having an affair with director Roberto Rossellini while still married. The backlash was so severe that she was banned from Hollywood, condemned by religious groups, and even denounced on the floor of the U.S. Senate as an example of moral corruption. Her worst nightmare had come true. Her once pristine image was tarnished overnight. Bergman spent years in exile, fearing she would never regain the love of her audience. Though she eventually made a triumphant return to Hollywood, the experience scarred her for life, leaving her with a constant fear of being judged and rejected. Laurence Olivier, fear of forgetting lines. Memory loss phobia. Laurence Olivier, one of the greatest stage and screen actors of all time, had a crippling fear of forgetting his lines while performing. Despite his commanding presence, Olivier's fear of memory lapses became so intense that he suffered from severe stage fright during live performances. At times, he would experience panic attacks before stepping on stage, convinced that his mind would go blank in front of the audience. As he aged, his fear worsened, and he began using cue cards and prompters to ease his anxiety. Even in his later years, despite being hailed as a legend, he dreaded losing control of his memory, as it meant the end of his career. James Dean, fear of premonitions and sudden death. James Dean had a strong belief in fate and premonitions, and he often spoke about having a deep fear of dying young. He would frequently tell friends that he had a feeling his life would be cut short. His fear of sudden death was eerily prophetic. Just weeks before his fatal car crash, Dean gave an interview warning young people about the dangers of reckless driving. Even his last words, reportedly, "That guy's gotta see us," reflected his anxiety about an imminent accident. His friends often said that he seemed obsessed with death, frequently discussing tragic endings and the idea that some people weren't meant to live long lives. Humphrey Bogart, fear of cancer. Humphrey Bogart, the tough guy star of Casablanca, had an irrational fear of developing cancer, despite being a heavy smoker and drinker. His carcinophobia led him to obsess over minor health issues, constantly worrying that he had a terminal illness. Ironically, his worst fear came true. Bogart was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in the 1950s. When doctors confirmed the disease, he fell into deep depression, convinced that he had willed his fate into existence. As his health declined, he became more paranoid and withdrawn, avoiding conversations about illness or death. Though he tried to keep up a strong front, his fear of cancer consumed his final years, making his passing even more tragic. Greta Garbo, fear of social interaction. Social anxiety disorder. Greta Garbo, the Swedish star known for her iconic beauty and mysterious aura, had a crippling fear of social interaction. She was deeply uncomfortable in large gatherings, hated doing interviews, and avoided Hollywood parties at all costs. Garbo's fear of social settings became so intense that she abandoned acting entirely and spent the rest of her life living in near-total isolation. She would take long walks alone in New York but refused to engage with fans or the media. Her famous quote, "I want to be alone," wasn't just a line from one of her films. It was the truth of how she wanted to live her life. Peter Lorre, fear of being typecast as a villain. Peter Lorre, the Hungarian-American actor famous for playing creepy villains, had a deep fear of being trapped in his own sinister image. While his distinct looks and eerie voice made him perfect for such roles, he longed to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor. This fear led him to turn down multiple offers that would have made him a horror icon, as he dreaded becoming a caricature of himself. Despite his attempts to break free, Hollywood refused to see him as anything but a villain, leading to a lifetime of frustration and resentment. Even in his later years, he expressed regret that he was forever trapped in a persona he had grown to hate: Jean Harlow, fear of water. Jean Harlow, the original blonde bombshell, had a terrifying fear of water. She refused to swim and avoided large bodies of water even when on vacation. Some reports suggest this phobia stemmed from a childhood, near-drowning incident, which left her with lifelong trauma. Harlow's aquaphobia was so severe that she would panic if she had to film scenes near water, making it difficult for directors to convince her to do beach or poolside shots. Even bathing was reportedly an ordeal for her, as she would never stay in the water too long. Her fear of water remained until her untimely death at just 26, adding yet another tragic layer to her short, troubled life. Robert Mitchum. Fear of being trapped in a routine. Robert Mitchum, the rugged bad boy of old Hollywood, had a deep fear of living a mundane life. He dreaded routine and predictability, which is why he often pushed boundaries and engaged in reckless behavior. Mitchum hated the idea of being just another Hollywood star, so he deliberately cultivated a wild, rebellious image, even getting arrested for marijuana possession to prove he wasn't just another clean-cut actor. His fear of routine extended to his work. He often grew bored with his roles and had a tendency to sabotage projects if he felt they were becoming too formulaic. His life was one long attempt to outrun the boredom he feared more than anything. Despite their larger-than-life personas, old Hollywood actors were just as vulnerable as anyone else when it came to fear. Whether it was a fear of death, failure, germs, or aging, these anxieties shaped their personal lives and careers. Some stars faced their fears head-on, while others let them take control. Either way, their phobias reveal a human side to the legends we often see as untouchable icons.